A shallow museum drawer in Jerusalem holds a brown parchment scrap no bigger than a hand. Its surface is rough as dried skin. Its edges curl inward like singed leaves. Fine dust sits in the cracks of the ink. Under the glass, it looks less like literature than evidence. By the late 4th century, authorities were deciding what counted and what did not. In 367, Athanasius of Alexandria circulated his Festal letter and drew a hard line around approved books. Around the same period, the Synod of Laodicea restricted what could be read publicly in church. Material tied to Enoch and the giants fell outside those boundaries, not copied into the standard stream, not preserved in ordinary reading, pushed to the edges because it expanded Genesis in ways later gatekeepers did not want normalized. Then the archives started coming back in pieces. In 1943, W.B. Henning published Manichaean fragments from Turfan in western China and showed that a forgotten book of giants had survived far beyond the ancient Near East. A few years later, the caves near Qumran began yielding Aramaic fragments from the same tradition, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls first brought to attention in 1947. By the time Joseph Milik published the Qumran Aramaic Enoch materials in the 1970s, the scale was impossible to ignore. This was not one stray page. It was a lost textual layer with witnesses in different languages, from different regions, preserved by different communities. The central claim is simple. The Book of Giants preserves an ancient record about named giant beings, their downfall, and a body of material later readers kept trying to relocate to the furthest, least accessible places on the map, including deserted islands. In the next several minutes, you'll see what the text says, what evidence shows, and why it was hidden. If buried records fascinate you, hit subscribe. Every week, we uncover what was removed from Scripture. But here's what makes this stranger. The Book of Giants is not just a larger version of Genesis 6. It is more specific than that. The surviving Qumran pieces are cataloged under numbers like 1Q23, 1Q24, 2Q26, 4Q203, 4Q530, 4Q532, 4Q533, and 6Q8. The names inside are not generic. Ohia, Hahia, Mahaweh. In some related witnesses, even Gilgamesh appears in the giant register. This is not background material. It is a structured account with speakers, dreams, journeys, petitions, and judgment. The confidence of the manuscript trail matters. Henning's Turfan publication in 1943 showed the work had a long afterlife in Manichaean transmission. Milik's work in 1971 and 1976 connected the Qumran Aramaic evidence to that wider tradition. Later scholars, especially Lauren Stuckenbrook, tightened the reconstruction and showed that the giant material was not a late curiosity stitched together out of fantasy. It belonged to the Enochic world already circulating before the Common Era. Different archives, different centuries, same core sequence. And the physical trail is just as important as the names. These were not recovered from a single clean library shelf. Qumran yielded caves, jars, fragments, and breaks. Turfan yielded another branch, carried east through a religious movement, later targeted and dispersed. What survives is exactly what you would expect, after centuries of selective copying and repeated disruption. Not polished completeness. Ragged survival. A line here. A proper name there. A speech opening without its ending. A judgment section preserved better in one stream than another. When separate witness lines keep locking together despite that damage, scholars pay attention because coincidence becomes a weaker explanation than shared ancestry. Look closely at the kinds of details that survive. A dream about a tablet submerged in water, a garden being destroyed, giants reacting in panic, a messenger moving between figures. These are not the kinds of features scribes usually invent by accident across multiple transmission lines. They are sticky features. They hold, they travel, they stay attached to a work because later copyists believed they belonged there. That is why the Book of Giants keeps pulling researchers back in. Even in fragments, it still carries narrative pressure. There is also the matter of scale. The book does not present giant figures as a decorative backdrop to someone else's drama. They are close enough to the center that the entire account turns on their fear, their dreams, and their attempt to get an interpretation before the sentence lands. That makes the work feel administrative, measured, almost procedural. Offense, warning, inquiry, reply, destruction. It reads less like a passing meditation and more like material preserved because somebody thought the sequence mattered, and this is where it gets disturbing. What we're looking at breaks into 6 parts. Part 1 sits behind Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4. Sons of heaven cross a boundary. Giants appear. The canonical passage gives you 4 verses and moves on. Part 2 is expanded in 1 Enoch 6 through 11 and 12 through 16. The Watchers descend, teach forbidden knowledge, corrupt the earth, and are sentenced. The frame is already judicial. The offense is recorded. The punishment is announced. Part 3 emerges in the Book of Giants fragments themselves, especially 4Q203 and the Cave 4 materials. Here the giants are no longer a passing result. They are actors. They speak. They fear what is coming. They experience dreams that point to destruction. Part 4 centers on the envoy figure Mahaway in 4Q530 and 4Q531. He travels to seek Enoch's interpretation. That detail matters because it turns the text from rumor into procedure. A messenger is sent. A response is requested. Judgment is not vague. It is delivered like a ruling. Part 5 carries the same material eastward. The turf and fragments, published by Henning, preserve the book in Manichaean form. Names shift. Languages shift. The backbone stays intact. Giant figures, ominous dreams, an appeal to Enoch, and a sentence already hanging over the whole account. Part 6 is the geographical afterlife. The book itself is fragmentary, but the pattern it leaves is clear. Gigantic offenders, bodies marked for destruction, knowledge buried with them. Later readers and collectors repeatedly push that material outward, away from cities, and toward cliffs, caves, deserts, and islands. The farther the location, the safer the archive. That last part needs to be understood carefully. The Book of Giants does not give us a surviving line that says, in plain terms, go to this island and dig here. What it gives us is the structure that makes island claims believable to later readers. Remote confinement, post-judgment remains, fragmented preservation, restricted access. Once those elements exist inside the textual imagination, abandoned islands become almost inevitable destinations for the later search. They function the same way desert caves functioned for the first discoverers, places where the normal traffic of history is thin, where damaged evidence can outlast institutions, and where any recovery will almost certainly be partial. The incomplete expedition pattern belongs here too. In the ancient phase, the return is incomplete because the manuscripts are incomplete. In the modern phase, the return is incomplete because the evidence arrives through scattered finds, private sales, damaged surfaces, and interrupted provenance. The phrase sounds dramatic, but in this case, it is also technically accurate. Nearly everyone who has approached this material has approached it through absence, missing margins, missing columns, missing context. Even the strongest reconstructions are working around loss. That is exactly why small details carry so much force. When a name like Mahaway appears, or when a dream motif in one fragment lines up with another witness far away, the agreement matters more than it would in a complete book. In a full manuscript, agreement is expected. In a broken archive, agreement is evidence. Now, if you read those parts in order, one feature stands out. The giants in this material are named and differentiated. They are not just a mass. Ohia and Hahia are treated as individuals. Mahaway is given a function. Enoch is approached as an interpreter, not a symbol. That is exactly what you expect from a remembered dossier, not from a decorative aside. The text behaves like a record that assumes its audience already knew the file. There is another detail people miss. The Qumran evidence does not survive as a neat bound book. It survives as shards spread across caves and catalog numbers. That means every reconstruction is partial by design. Almost every modern encounter with the Book of Giants is incomplete before the reading even begins. Not because the work was minor, because the surviving record was broken, dispersed, and left to be reassembled from debris. That pattern is one reason the island language around this subject took hold so easily in modern imagination. When a text keeps pointing to confinement, isolation, destruction, and remote preservation, later readers start attaching it to the kinds of places where hard evidence disappears into terrain. Desert caves first, then sea cliffs, then abandoned islands. The map expands because the fragments invite projection. But the projection only works because the core material is already dense, specific, and stubbornly physical. The modern parallel is not hard to see. In the last decade, imaging and conservation work on scroll materials has kept proving that damaged fragments hold more data than earlier readers thought. Multispectral photography, infrared examination, and laboratory analysis have repeatedly pulled legible traces from surfaces once treated as nearly lost. The same lesson keeps returning. Fragment does not mean empty. Partial does not mean invented. A broken witness can still preserve a precise memory. There is a second modern parallel, and it sits in the science of interpretation itself. Researchers who work on fragmentary archives do not assume that a damaged text is useless. They map fibers, compare handwriting, track recurring formulas, and test whether isolated pieces belong to the same compositional world. That is exactly how the Book of Giants regained its shape, not through a single dramatic moment, but through disciplined accumulation. A line from Cave 4. A name preserved in a Manichaean witness, a thematic match with Enochic judgment scenes, a reconstruction proposed, challenged, and refined. What emerges is not certainty about every missing word. What emerges is confidence about the work's existence, profile, and place in a larger textual family. And that matters because the ancient claim at the center of the material is itself about aftermath. The giants do not dominate the book because they are triumphant. They dominate it because judgment is closing in. Their size is not the last word. Their exposure is. That moral architecture survives every fragment loss. The bodies are temporary. The record of what happened to them is what keeps resurfacing. That matters when people laugh off giant material as if it appeared from nowhere. It did not appear from nowhere. It appears in an identifiable textual environment. Genesis 6 gives the compressed notice. Enoch expands the rebellion. The Book of Giants tracks named figures inside the fallout. The Turfan finds confirm that the work kept moving after its original setting vanished. That is not random accumulation. That is transmission. Here's what the translators left out. Most readers meet the Nephilim as a brief interruption in Genesis and never see the names, the dreams, or the petition to Enoch. They never see Ohia and Haya reacting to judgment. They never see Mahaweh sent for interpretation. They never see that some witnesses draw Gilgamesh into the same giant horizon. Once those details are restored, the material stops reading like a stray verse and starts reading like a suppressed extension with its own internal bureaucracy. It matters because named actors are harder to dismiss than anonymous ones. A list can be ignored. A dossier with personalities, missions, and rulings is another thing entirely. The suppression starts at Athanasius of Alexandria in 367. He did not name the Book of Giants line by line, but his canon boundary helped normalize which texts would be copied and which would drift. The chain continues with the Synod of Laodicea in the later 4th century, where limits on public readings narrowed the field again. Jerome knew Enochic material, but did not carry it into the mainstream biblical frame. Augustine treated the giant traditions with skepticism and pushed readers back towards safer interpretive ground. Then, the imperial pressure falls on Manichaean transmission. Under Theodosius, and later anti-Manichaean legislation, the communities that preserved parallel giant material were treated as enemies. By the time later catalogs of rejected books hardened into habit, the result was the same everywhere that mattered: reduced circulation, reduced copying, reduced legitimacy. Add the sequence together, and you can see the mechanism. A text does not have to be ceremonially burned in every city to be functionally buried. It only needs to be denied ordinary copying. It only needs to be labeled suspect by the right authorities. It only needs the communities preserving it to become marginal, then unlawful, then scattered. Once that happens, survival becomes geographic. The archive flees to caves, desert caches, distant monasteries, and eastern repositories. It survives where administration weakens. That is one reason the Book of Giants is so valuable now. It lets you watch suppression in slow motion, not one dramatic ban and then silence, a narrowing of acceptable reading, a shrinking of scribal attention, a transfer of preservation to communities later condemned. Then centuries in which the mainstream remembers, the giant episode in outline but not in detail. The result is a public memory with its center cut out. That does not mean every official involved sat in a room plotting over giant bones. It means a chain of decisions made the archive easier to lose. First, you mark a text as outside approved reading. Then you tie one surviving branch of it to a condemned movement. Then you stop copying it. Then fragments surface centuries later, and people act surprised that the evidence is broken. Now, here's where it gets active. In 2020, after months of scientific testing, experts concluded that all the supposed Dead Sea Scroll fragments at the Museum of the Bible in Washington were modern forgeries. Earlier concerns had already led to pieces being removed from display in 2018. The report described deliberate fabrication on ancient-looking leather. Think about what that means. The market around forbidden Second Temple material is not just confused, it is contaminated. False fragments are inserted right where genuine provenance is already fragile. Noise is added to the record at exactly the point where the public can no longer tell what is real without lab work. That is not ancient suppression. That is modern interference. And once interference enters the chain, the old pattern repeats in a new form. Real fragments become harder to trust. Sensational claims get rewarded. Careful reconstructions get buried under louder nonsense. The material is not only fragmentary in the cave, it is fragmentary in the modern information environment too. Every expedition returns incomplete because the archive is incomplete, the market is compromised, and the conversation is constantly being flooded with substitutes. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying a modern excavation has produced a verified warehouse of giant skeletons on a named island and that museums are hiding it. But what the text describes, when you look at it carefully, matches a durable pattern. Remembered giant figures, a judicial sentence against them, physical aftermath, and a repeated tendency to push the surviving evidence to remote zones where recovery is difficult and certainty stays low. That is why the deserted island angle will not die. Not because the Qumran fragments hand over a tourist map. They do not. It survives because the Book of Giants trains the reader to think in terms of exile, distance, buried remains, and damaged records. Once a tradition is built that way, later generations attach it to the loneliest landscapes they know. Sometimes that means a cave above the Dead Sea. Sometimes a cliff in Central Asia. Sometimes an island no one can fully search. The geography shifts. The mechanism stays the same. What we have to confront is the simplest explanation that fits the evidence. If independent fragments from Qumran and Turfan preserve the same giant tradition across different languages and communities, that is not an accidental echo. If the material names figures, records dreams, sends a messenger, and delivers judgment in sequence, that is not a casual embellishment to 4 verses in Genesis. If canon boundaries, anti-Manichaean pressure, and centuries of selective copying kept this literature outside the main scriptural stream, that is not neutral transmission. If modern forgery scandals cluster around precisely the kinds of fragments the public most wants to see, that is not a sign that the archive was always simple and transparent. The conclusion is not that every rumor about giant remains is true. The conclusion is narrower and stronger than that. The Book of Giants is documentation of a real, ancient tradition that treated the giant episode as a major event, not a marginal curiosity. It preserved names. It preserved procedures. It preserved fear. And because it did, later authorities and later markets both had reasons to control how that material would be seen. So when you hear that an abandoned island hides colossal remains and every expedition returned incomplete, the responsible reading is not to swallow the claim whole. It is to recognize the older pattern underneath it. Broken records, remote settings, missing context, surviving names, a text that refuses to stay buried even when only a fraction of it remains. That is why the little parchment scrap matters. It is not large. It is not complete. It does not need to be. It sits under the glass with its cracked ink and curled edges, carrying more weight than its size should allow. It is still there, still rough under the light, still holding names most people never learned to read, exactly the way the desert kept it.